He is a simple carpenter from a small town. After his wife dies in childbirth, he raises his twin daughters alone. Despite his poverty, he loves them more than anything. He sells his last hope, his carpentry shop, to pay for the girls' education. Everyone in the town laughs at him. "You're a fool. Why invest in girls if they will leave and leave you alone?" But years later, everything changed. Mr. Duncan was a humble carpenter living in a small, tightly knit town where everyone knew each other's joys and sorrows. His days were spent working with his trusty tools in his modest workshop, crafting everything from sturdy tables to intricate window frames that adorned the homes of his neighbors. Life had always been simple for him, a peaceful rhythm of sunrise to sunset, and a deep-rooted pride in creating beauty with his hands. But nothing in his life could have prepared him for the shattering tragedy that would forever change his destiny. It was a cold, overcast morning when his dear wife, Eleanor, went into labor. The entire town had gathered at the small, whitewashed clinic, whispers of hope mingling with the anxious hum of expectation. Eleanor, beloved for her gentle smile and nurturing spirit, had been the light of Mr. Duncan's life. Their union had been a promise of simplicity and enduring love, fortified by the belief that together they could overcome any hardship. However, that day, as fate would cruelly dictate, things took a devastating turn. In the midst of the turbulent contractions and hurried footsteps in the sterile corridors of the delivery room, Eleanor's pain turned to trauma. The labor, graver and more perilous than anyone had imagined, claimed her life just as she brought forth new life into the world. In the hushed aftermath, Mr. Duncan found himself in the hospital's cold waiting area, cradling his tiny, fragile daughters, identical twins whose innocent faces glowed with a bittersweet mixture of vulnerability and potential. The room, heavy with sorrow and murmurs of condolences, transformed into a surreal sanctuary where grief and hope intermingled. As nurses wrapped the newborns in soft blankets, Mr. Duncan felt every heartbeat slice through the silence, reminding him of the immense loss that now defined his life. He had not only lost his life partner, but the shared dream of a family that once paralleled the warmth of his modest home. That day, at the graveyard beneath a pale, weeping sky, Mr. Duncan knelt beside Eleanor's modest tombstone. The crisp air mingled with the scent of freshly turned earth as he clutched one of the tiny blankets in his calloused hands. A distant memory of her laughter echoed in his mind, and for a moment, the ticking of the clock seemed to pause, giving him space to grieve. Amid his pain and loneliness, a voice, a stern but sorrowful warning from his mother-in-law, cut through the murk of his anguish. "Mr. Duncan," she had said in a voice as cold as the winter wind, "they will ruin you. Their future is not in your hands." But even as the harshness of her words pricked his already tender heart, he looked down at his sleeping daughters, barely more than swaddled bundles of hope, and whispered softly, "They are the only reason I still live." In that fragile moment, beneath the gray sky and the rustling of the falling leaves, he made a solemn vow. He promised that he, a simple carpenter with muddy hands and a steadfast spirit, would do everything in his power to provide them with a future full of opportunity and love, even if it meant sacrificing every precious piece of his own hope. The early months that followed were a blur of sorrow, sleepless nights, and the steady sound of a heart pounding with both grief and fierce resolve. Mr. Duncan had no choice but to become both father and mother, a role he embraced with humble determination. He fashioned a new routine. Every morning before the dawn, he would whisper gentle lullabies to his daughters as he fed them warm porridge, and by the faint light of dusk, he would read from the tattered storybooks that he had managed to salvage from happier times. In between the creaks of his aging workshop and the persistent drip of the leaky roof at home, he nurtured a love so uncompromising that it defied the bitter taste of loss. As he built small cradles out of reclaimed wood and mended old toys with careful hands, Mr. Duncan's gaze would often stray towards the horizon. He envisioned his daughters flourishing in a world that could be kind if only one had the courage to believe in the goodness of the future. Even as poverty gnawed at the edges of their daily lives and whispers of despair were carried on the wind, his determination remained unshakable. Every splinter in the wood, every drop of sweat on his brow, was a reminder of the promise he had etched near Eleanor's grave. a promise to create a world where his little girls would know not only love, but the respect and opportunity they deserved. In that small town, where the echo of each loss mingled with the hope of every new beginning, Mr. Duncan silently prepared for a future that would test him in ways he could scarcely imagine. He was driven not by grand aspirations of wealth or reason, but by the boundless love for his twin daughters, the light of his life, and the fervent belief that even the deepest sorrow could be transformed through acts of sacrifice, resilience, and endless devotion. After the pain of loss had settled into the corners of his heart, Mr. Duncan continued on with the arduous journey of single parenthood. The long days and many nights spent laboring in his modest carpentry workshop, nursing scraped knees and tender hearts, slowly became a ritual of hope and perseverance. Yet even as he devoted every ounce of his being to the care and education of his twin daughters, an aching loneliness began to gnaw at him. After all, he was a man burdened by loss, and the weight of that solitude pressed upon him silently with every sunrise. It was during one of those lonely, rain-soaked evenings that fate introduced him to Margaret. At first glance, Margaret appeared to be the comforting balm he so desperately needed. She was warm in manner, soft-spoken, and possessed a gentle smile that made her seem as nurturing as a dear friend rather than a stranger. With her kind eyes and caring words, she seemed to promise the kind of companionship that could fill the void of loneliness. The townsfolk, already familiar with Mr. Duncan's humble nature and his deep devotion to his daughters, welcomed her presence as a potential new chapter in his life, a chance for the carpenter to find solace and stability once again. In the early days of their courtship, Margaret showered Mr. Duncan with gentle assurances and tender gestures. She listened to his stories of loss and hope over quiet cups of tea, and she spoke as if understanding every sorrow and every silent prayer for a better future. Encouraged by her apparent empathy, Mr. Duncan allowed himself to dream that perhaps he had finally found a kindred spirit, someone who could not only stand by him but also extend her love to his precious daughters. For a time, it seemed that the promise of a loving stepmother might ease the burdens of his solitary existence. However, as the months passed, the illusion of warmth began to crack. Beneath her soft-spoken exterior, Margaret's true nature slowly revealed itself. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. A dismissive gesture here, a sharp tone there. What began as mild impatience soon escalated into open disdain. The very qualities that once made her seem caring were now overshadowed by an undercurrent of cruelty, particularly directed at the twin girls. In public, when the family visited the town square or attended community gatherings, the whispers of those around often revolved around Margaret's icy remarks. She would look at the girls with a condescending glare and, in quiet but cutting tones, refer to them as bastards. Words meant to sting deeply and diminish the value of their fragile existence. At home, the atmosphere transformed from one of reluctant hope to a potboiler of resentment and emotional strife. Margaret, once the beacon of a fresh beginning, began to dominate the household with rigid rules and unforgiving criticism. The girls, who had once giggled innocently at the simplest joys, grew withdrawn and silent under her relentless verbal assaults. They learned early on that even the gentlest attempt at a smile or a hopeful question would be met with a sneer or a dismissive retort. The tender moments that Mr. Duncan had once carefully nurtured with bedtime stories and handcrafted toys were gradually replaced by attention that reeked of neglect and contempt. Despite his love for his daughters, Mr. Duncan found himself trapped in an emotional web of constant conflict. Alone at times in his workshop or during the late hours when the lamplight flickered against the dark windows of their modest home, he would weep quietly, thinking of Eleanor, the one whose gentle spirit had once lit their lives. He remembered her final words, the promise he made beneath her grave, and he vowed to shield his girls from any harm. But each time Margaret's harshness surfaced, he felt the sting of failure and the weight of isolation. His every attempt to defend the children against her biting words was met with disdain, creating a chasm in their little family that widened with each passing day. Inevitably, the breaking point could not be ignored. The relentless assault on his daughters' tender hearts, combined with the constant belittling of their very existence, drove Mr. Duncan into a state of profound despair. Friends and neighbors began to murmur in hushed tones. Why invest so much in those girls when they will leave you alone someday? They ridiculed his sacrifices, calling him foolish for letting his heart dictate terms in a world that seemed to value harsh practicality above love. Yet, despite the barbs and the scorn, Mr. Duncan's resolve never truly wavered, at least not until Margaret's cruelty reached a level that left no other path. After months of enduring unchecked maltreatment and realizing that the unity of their household was beyond repair, Mr. Duncan made the painful decision to stand up for his daughter's future. The very woman who had seemed to promise a second chance had betrayed his trust in the most personal way. The marriage crumbled under the weight of endless arguments and tearful confrontations, leaving in its wake the bitter taste of disappointment and isolation. In the aftermath of the separation, Mr. Duncan and his daughters found themselves cast out, not only by the failing of a marriage but also by the community's callous laughter. The town, ever quick to judge, labeled him a fool for investing in his daughter's education and future. They repeated that cry with venom. "You fool! Why invest in girls when they will leave you alone?" Those words haunted Mr. Duncan as he struggled to keep his head high. With the divorce final and Margaret vanishing from his life like a bitter ghost, he was left with nothing but his love for his children and the echoes of a once promising union turned sour. The humiliation of it all reigned over his days, as he tried to piece together a future that the town deemed unworthy of his sacrifices. Yet, deep within, the love for his twin daughters burned brighter than the harsh accusations and the relentless mockery of society, even if it meant facing further isolation. Their smiles, once so unburdened before Margaret's reign of cruelty, were the only lights that kept his weary heart resilient in a world that now seemed determined to trample on hope. The following months brought hardships that no skilled carpenter had ever imagined. The weight of a bitter divorce and relentless mockery from the town's gossips settled over Mr. Duncan like an unyielding winter frost. For years, his small carpentry workshop had been the sanctuary of his craft and the heartbeat of his modest income. A place where every notch of wood and every carefully chiseled edge represented hope for his daughter's future. But with every cruel word from neighbors and every sneer uttered in passing, the decision that had once been easy became wrenching. When it came time to secure the education of his twin daughters, a future that he believed was the only beacon of salvation amid their struggles, he knew there was no turning back. With the quiet determination born of a father's love, Mr. Duncan made the heart-wrenching choice to sell his workshop, the very foundation of his livelihood. He arranged a low-key auction in the town's modest meeting hall, where many gathered more out of curiosity than respect, and the whispers were palpable. Those who had once shared memories of wood shavings and the comforting clatter of tools now jeered at him, calling him a fool. "Why waste your life investing in girls who'll one day leave you all alone?" they mocked. Their laughter echoed long after the deal was struck. In that moment, Mr. Duncan's last hope, his pride and the tangible measure of his hard work, was exchanged for a modest sum, barely enough to secure tuition fees and basic schooling. Every splinter removed from his personal possession felt like a piece of his soul being chipped away, yet he clung to the belief that the future was worth every sacrifice. Without the steady hum of his workshop, life began to unravel into stark poverty. Forced to leave behind the dilapidated but cherished building that had nurtured his craft for decades, Mr. Duncan and his daughters moved into a ramshackle barack on the outskirts of town, a place far removed from the comforting rhythm of his former life. The barack was a meager structure, its walls thin and the roof leaking during even the smallest drizzle. Yet, in that dreary space, the father's love and diligence for his little ones shone brighter than any grand edifice could. Every cold night, as he huddled by a single, sputtering heater and shared a simple meal of bread and water, Mr. Duncan's mind wandered to the promise he had made by Eleanor's grave, a promise that his daughter's education would be the beacon that led them to a brighter tomorrow. The transformation of his life did not go unnoticed in the small town, where tongues wagged as readily as the seasonal wind. Neighbors who once merely nodded in polite greeting now overtly laughed, shaking their heads at what they saw as a foolish investment. "You're a madman," they jeered in hushed conversations whenever he passed by, pouring what little you have into their education, as if that will ever change anything. Their ridicule stung like coarse gravel in an open wound. Mr. Duncan's reputation for self-sacrifice, already tarnished by the scars of divorce and hardship, became the subject of gossip and contempt. Yet, amid the scorn and derision, he held tight to one truth. His daughters were precious beyond any material measure, and their ability to learn and grow was worth every hardship he faced. Every day, Mr. Duncan struggled through odd jobs, laboring on construction sites, cleaning up after others, and sometimes even mending broken fixtures for a pittance, all to ensure that there was money left for his daughter's school fees and books. The nights were long and sleepless, with dreams of a future where his girls would excel in academics, rise above the poverty that had tried to steal their childhood, and eventually prove all their doubters wrong. Their letters, when they came, were filled with hope. "Daddy, I'm the first in my class," one would exclaim in scribbled notes. Even if the letters became fewer with time, his steadfast belief in their potential never wavered. In that harsh new reality, the echo of every mocking phrase from the townspeople, "You fool! Why invest in girls when they'll leave you alone?" served as both a dagger and a spur in his heart. Instead of succumbing to bitterness, Mr. Duncan used the jeers as silent fuel for his unspoken determination. He realized that a man's worth was not measured by the approval of his neighbors or the weight of his bank account, but by the sacrifices he made for the ones he loved. Every chipped nail and every splinter that lodged into his calloused hands was a symbol of his resolve to create a better future for his daughters, even if the world deemed his choices foolish. Thus, with the sale of his workshop, the loss of his proud occupational identity, and a humble migration into a creaking barrack, Mr. Duncan embraced a destiny forged in sacrifice. His actions, though mocked by many, were driven solely by the fierce, enduring love of a father for his children. A love that believed that true success is measured by the lives we uplift rather than by the material comforts we amass. In the silent determination of that struggling carpenter, the ember of hope burned ever brighter, preparing the stage for a future that would one day astonish them all. Time passed slowly in the barren rhythm of hardship, each day etched with challenges that tested Mr. Duncan's resolve. The creaking barrack that had become their makeshift home bore witness to countless nights of hunger and the muted sobs of exhaustion. Yet in the midst of poverty and fatigue, a spark of hope burned steadily in the heart of the humble carpenter. Every morning, before the weak light of dawn penetrated the curtains of their cold, cramped dwelling, Mr. Duncan would rise with a singular purpose: to create the future his daughters so desperately deserved. He took on odd jobs wherever he could find them, working long hours as a laborer on construction sites, cleaning offices in neighboring towns, and sometimes mending broken furniture in exchange for a few meager dollars. His work was grueling and unrewarding, often leaving him with blistered, calloused hands and a body that ached from endless exertion. In these moments of physical torment, when hunger gnawed at his stomach and the chilled wind seeped through thin walls, his thoughts invariably turned to his twin daughters. Their future, bright and trembling with possibility, was the anchor in his life. Every sacrifice he made was a promise kept to them, a promise that their education would be the ladder out of the despair that enveloped them. Though the days blurred into one another, there were pockets of relief that made the struggle bearable. Once or twice a month, Mr. Duncan would receive a letter from one or both of his cherished girls. The envelope, filled with scribbled pride and the earnest language of youthful determination, served as a beacon of light amid the overwhelming darkness. In a neat, loopy handwriting, one of the letters would declare, "Daddy, I'm the first in my class," while the other might note, "I won the spelling bee today." Every word etched on those pages reminded him that his sacrifices were not in vain. The promise of education was more than a ticket out of poverty. It was a testament to the strength and intelligence of his daughters, a validation that his desperate quest to secure their future was paying off, one hard-earned milestone at a time. Each letter was a small miracle, a reaffirmation of hope that fueled Mr. Duncan's determination during the lonely nights. When the hardships became almost unbearable, when cold, empty nights and the soundless echo of his own footsteps on the creaking wooden floors threatened to drown him in despair, he would unfold one of those precious letters and read their words aloud. The sound of his gentle, trembling voice reciting, "I'm first in my class," or "I made the honor roll," momentarily washed away the tears of exhaustion and reminded him why he braved the harshness of life day after day. In those words lay the promise of a new beginning, a beacon cutting through the oppressive gloom of their reality. Outside, the town remained unkind, its narrow-minded whispers and contemptuous laughter like a constant reminder of what society thought of his sacrifice. Neighbors eyed him with pity or derision as he trudged by in patched clothes and worn-out boots, their pointed remarks echoing in his mind. "Look at that fool, still clinging to his daughters when they'll surely outgrow him," or "Why invest so much in girls who will leave you alone someday?" Yet, Mr. Duncan refused to be crushed by the heavy weight of other people's scorn. Instead, he pressed on, steadfast and dignified, convinced that the value of a person is never measured by shallow prejudices but by the depth of their love and the sacrifices they are willing to make. In the quiet hours of early morning or the fading light of dusk, when sleep proved elusive and the silent strain of loneliness crept into his bones, he would sit by the battered window of their barack, looking out at the barren field behind their meager home. There, in the stillness, he allowed himself to dream. He envisioned a day when his daughters would step into a world far removed from the bitter confines of poverty, a world where they would be celebrated for their intelligence and grit, not scorned for their origins. He pictured them, confident and triumphant, in cap and gown at a grand graduation, their eyes bright with the promise of change. Images that kept him walking long roads, scaling grueling heights, and enduring the relentless hardships of life. Years of hardship slowly turned into years of relentless perseverance, etched into every splinter of wood and every frayed edge of his calloused hands. With time, each poorly paid job, each bitter moment of isolation, became part of a greater narrative. A narrative of a man whose love for his daughters was so boundless that the very poverty which tried to suffocate their dreams was transformed into the fuel for their future. Even against the murmurings of disbelieving townsfolk, Mr. Duncan never once wavered from his belief that every sacrifice made in the name of love was an investment in the promise of something extraordinary. In the pages of each passing day, the struggle became not just a story of economic hardship, but an epic of a father's relentless determination to offer his daughters the light of education. A light that, despite the darkness of their humble surroundings, shone brighter with every letter, every triumph, and every small victory against the odds. Time marched forward with a slow, grinding inevitability. The seasons changed, and in the muted rhythm of the small town, the once diligent correspondence from Mr. Duncan's twin daughters began to fade. It started subtly, a missed letter here, a delayed reply there. In the early days of their struggle, every scrap of paper bearing their eager, clumsy handwriting had been a lifeline. Now, as months turned into years, the familiar pages of hopeful news and shining achievements grew scarcer. The twins, once full of sparkling declarations of academic triumphs and small personal victories, now wrote little or not at all. Mr. Duncan's battered mailbox, once heavy with the promise of a brighter future, slowly emptied until only the hollow sound of wind rattled its hinges. Each time Mr. Duncan reached for the envelope, his heart would race with anticipation, only to be met with silence, an aching void that resonated with the echoes of earlier times. The absence of their words weighed heavily on him. He wondered, though in a state of quiet resignation, if his daughters had forgotten him. The idea was a bitter pill, that the very children he had loved, nurtured, and sacrificed everything for might one day outgrow their father entirely, leaving him as nothing more than a ghost in the fabric of their lives. In the narrow lanes of the village, whispers began to circulate. Neighbors, who once saluted him with gentle nods of admiration for his unwavering devotion, now traded slanderous remarks in hushed tones. "They've forgotten him," many would say, shaking their heads as they passed his modest dwelling. "He's all alone now." These words dripped with cruelty, each syllable like ice water over a wounded spirit. Over time, the collective indifference of his community felt like a final, resounding verdict. The town's dismissive laughter and pitying glances provided an ever-present reminder that in their eyes, he was an outdated relic clinging to a dream that was no longer worth the sacrifice. Mr. Duncan, however, pressed on without complaint. His life had become a mosaic of simple routines marred by solitude. He labored on odd jobs at daybreak, his calloused hands and tired eyes bearing the hard truth of a life spent sacrificing. Their dilapidated barack was now both sanctuary and cell, a place filled with memories of love and looming specters of isolation. Evenings were spent in a quiet vigil by the narrow window, where he would watch the last rays of the sun vanish behind the distant hills, imagining the far-off future his daughters might be building without him. Then came the day that cut his already fragile heart a little deeper. His birthday. The sky was wrapped in a melancholy gray, punctuating the day with a prelude of rain. Mr. Duncan awoke on that morning with the familiar ache of loneliness. No cheerful greetings, no surprise cards, no fresh letter graced his day. Instead, it was as though the world itself had conspired to let the day pass in silence. In the small, creaking kitchen of his barack, he prepared the only meal he could afford, stale bread softened with a sparse spread of butter, accompanied by a small glass of water. There was no lavish feast, no thoughtful gathering, only the bleak ritual of another birthday spent in profound isolation. In the dim light of the early afternoon, he sat at the rickety table staring at his meager meal. The quiet of the day was punctuated only by the distant murmur of voices from neighbors and the soft hiss of the old heater struggling against the cold. His eyes, tired and sorrowful, betrayed the tumult of feelings within, a mingled sense of duty and a resigned desolation. As he slowly chewed his bread, memories of his daughters, the sparkle in their eyes when they announced a new triumph, the proud clamor in their scribbled letters proclaiming each hard-won victory, seemed to float just beyond his grasp. Their absence was deafening. By twilight, with no letters to be found and no unexpected knock at the door, a single tear escaped the weathered lines on his face. It was the tear of a man who had given his life in the hope that love, no matter how deeply sacrificed, would eventually be rewarded. In that solitary moment, Mr. Duncan allowed himself the grace of raw emotion, a few quiet weeping breaths that mingled with the fading light. The grief was not just for lost letters or missed milestones. It was for the fading promise of a future he had so long clung to, a future where his daughters would one day stand tall and remember the sacrifices made for them. And so, in the solitude of that birthday, with nothing more than bread, water, and a heart full of unspoken prayers, Mr. Duncan faced the relentless whispers of the town. He had become, in their eyes, a forgotten relic, a man forsaken by the very people he cherished the most. Yet, in his silent ache, a stubborn ember of hope persisted. Even as the community believed they had moved on and that his daughters had left him behind, Mr. Duncan's heart remained steady in its quiet defiance of despair. For he knew, deep in his soul, that the truest measure of a person was not in the fleeting echoes of public opinion, but in the steadfast love and sacrifice poured out unnoticed, day after day. The long years of solitude and struggle had all led to that singular, breathtaking moment. It was a cool, overcast afternoon, the sky a gentle blanket of gray over the dilapidated homestead, where Mr. Duncan had spent decades nurturing his love for his twin daughters despite unrelenting hardships. His once proud woodworking shop was now a memory, replaced by a creaking barack that sheltered his worn body and a heart that had known more heartache than most. Neighbors still whispered cruelly in passing, their voices echoing off weathered walls. "They've forgotten him," they joked. "That old fool investing in girls who will eventually leave him." But Mr. Duncan had never let those words diminish his fierce, unyielding devotion. Even when the silence of his daughters had grown so long that his world seemed as barren as the neglected fields outside his home. Then, on an afternoon that promised nothing more than the routine melancholy of another lonely day, a low, rumbling engine broke through the oppressive stillness. Mr. Duncan, tending quietly to the sparse garden behind his homestead, a few struggling herbs and wildflowers that stubbornly fought the odds, lifted his weary eyes. In the distance, emerging like a sleek shadow against the muted backdrop of time-worn stone and overgrown hedges, a black SUV glided slowly up the dusty lane. Its polished surface shone like an unexpected beacon of modernity in contrast to the faded history that clung to every brick of his home. Curiosity and a tremor of something ancient and hopeful stirred within him. He stood up slowly, his back bent from years of labor and sorrow, and walked to the sagging front porch. The world around him seemed to pause for a heartbeat, the rustle of wind through brittle leaves, the distant sound of a car door closing. Even the steady hum of his own heartbeat appeared to slow, as if listening in on fate's quiet advance. The SUV came to a graceful stop just beyond his creaking wooden fence. Neighbors, drawn to the unusual sight, peered from behind peeling shutters and cracked windows. Their hushed murmurs carried across the street in a mixture of incredulity and envy. After all, it was not every day that something so polished and refined intruded upon their humble surroundings. Mr. Duncan's hands, rough and calloused from years of honest work, trembled slightly, not out of fear, but from the weight of unspoken longing and countless prayers whispered into the silence over so many years of loneliness. The SUV's door swung open, revealing two women stepping out into the cool light of the afternoon. They moved with deliberate grace and confidence, a stark contrast to the tired, meek figure that Mr. Duncan had become. Dressed impeccably and tailored, expensive suits that glimmered subtly with hints of modern elegance, the women radiated an aura of strength and refinement. Their eyes, bright and resolute, carried stories of triumph born from a childhood once shadowed by hardship. In every step they took, the years of struggle seemed to melt away, replaced by a vibrant promise of a future crafted from perseverance and hope. As the women approached the weathered front door, the decades of separation seemed to shatter as if by an unseen force. Neighbors watched in awe from behind their curtains, mouths agape, as the two figures advanced along the cracked path. Time appeared to condense into a single, emotionally charged moment. One of the women paused just at the threshold of the sagging porch, her eyes softening with a tenderness that belied the cool professionalism of her attire. With a voice trembling slightly, as if echoing both love and the bittersweet passage of years, she spoke a single, fateful word, tattoo. In that simple two-syllable utterance, half a plea, half a greeting, the weight of every long, lonely day bore down upon Mr. Duncan. His heart, worn and beaten by life's myriad hardships, constricted with a rush of emotions he had kept at bay for so long. In her gaze, filled with both admiration and unconditional love, he recognized the daughter he had always known in spirit, even as the world had told him she was lost to him. Tears, unbidden and unashamed, gathered in his eyes as he took a faltering step forward. It was as if all the silent letters from years past had converged into that single, heart-rending moment. Not a reproach but a reward for a father who had never stopped believing. The other daughter, her eyes alight with both pride and an unmistakable determination, reached out her hand, beckoning him to come closer. The silence of the years was broken only by the soft murmur of the wind and the distant gasps of the gathered onlookers. In that moment, the old, battered homestead was transformed from a monument of sorrow to a sanctuary of hope and reconciliation. The daughters, now accomplished and undeniably radiant, not only returned but carried with them the promise of a future that would challenge every mistaken judgment cast upon their father. Whispers began to spread like wildfire through the once judgmental town. They said, "Look at them, so successful, so elegant, and they remember their father's sacrifice." The arrival was unexpected and transformative, as if the very foundation of the community would soon be reshaped by the love and determination embodied in that reunion. As Mr. Duncan hesitantly walked down the worn steps of his porch toward the embracing figures of his daughters, the past and present collided in a bittersweet harmony. For the first time in many years, hope and pride surged through his weary veins. The daughters' expressions promised not just a reunion but a revolution, a reversal of fortunes and a vindication of a man's relentless devotion. In that charged moment, the laughter and scorn of the town receded into insignificance. All that remained was the undeniable, enduring power of love returning home. In the weeks that followed that life-changing reunion, the air in the once-forgotten town seemed to hum with an unfamiliar energy. The arrival of Mr. Duncan's daughters had not only vindicated the quiet, steadfast love of a dedicated father, it had sparked a transformation in the very fabric of the community. No longer was Mr. Duncan the laughingstock of the neighborhood. The memory of scorn had been replaced by awe and deep admiration for the sacrifices of a man who had given everything for his children. The daughters, now gleaming with achievement and discernible self-assurance, revealed that their return was no mere emotional reunion. In a private gathering held in the softly lit, renovated parlor of the old homestead, they shared with their father a secret that they had carefully nurtured over the past years away. With eyes that brimmed with determination and gratitude, they explained how, during their years of study and emerging success, they had not forgotten the sacrifices made on that cold day when Mr. Duncan sold his only livelihood, the carpentry workshop, to pay for their education. Every accolade they received, every scholarship or prize, was driven by a fervent desire to honor the memory of their late mother and to validate every hardship their father had endured. Quietly, one of the daughters, her voice steady but full of deep emotion, lifted an envelope from a velvet-lined box. "Tattoo," she said, using the nickname that had been his beacon of hope through all their struggles. "We have something to show you." Inside the envelope lay a series of documents and letters that detailed their long-fought journey, a narrative of perseverance, gratitude, and remarkable success. They had managed, through years of scholarships, part-time work, and humble savings, to accumulate enough funds to not only repay the debt incurred from selling the workshop, but to set aside a substantial sum towards rebuilding a future. In a surprising revelation that left Mr. Duncan momentarily speechless, his daughters announced that they had pooled their resources with the help of philanthropic mentors they met during their studies. Together, they had purchased the very parcel of land where their father's decrepit barack and fragmented memories had stood for decades. With tears glistening in his eyes, Mr. Duncan listened as they explained their plan. The land would be transformed into a new center of creativity and learning, an emblem of hope and renewal rising from the hardships of the past. At the heart of this initiative would be a brand new carpentry workshop, built in honor of Mr. Duncan and proudly displaying his name above the door. It would serve as both a tribute to his long-lost workshop and a beacon of opportunity for others in the community who sought to learn the craft, reinforcing that true talent and dedication can transform lives. But that was not all. The daughters had also arranged for a generous endowment to establish one of the region's largest philanthropic educational foundations, dedicated to supporting underprivileged children, named in honor of their late mother, whose gentle spirit had once illuminated their lives. The foundation was designed to provide scholarships, mentorship programs, and technical training, ensuring that every child, regardless of their background, was given the chance for a brighter future. This initiative, which set in motion a wave of new opportunities in the community, stood as living proof that investments in education and compassion were the strongest currencies of all. The community's response to these astounding gestures was swift and transformative. Neighbors who had once sneered at Mr. Duncan's sacrifices now found themselves humbled by the strength of a father's love and the incredible achievements of his daughters. The mocking voices that once echoed through narrow streets were gradually replaced by murmurs of admiration and heartfelt congratulations. Local newspapers and even regional media began to gather notes and photographs of the new workshop's construction. A sturdy, elegantly designed structure that bore the proud inscription Duncan's Carpentry Learning Center in bold, handcrafted lettering. Alongside it, discussions of the educational foundation stirred hope in the hearts of many, promising to uplift entire generations from despair to empowerment. At the inauguration of the new center, Mr. Duncan, standing abreast his accomplished daughters beneath an archway of fresh oak and vibrant blossoms, was asked to speak. With a deep, resonant voice that trembled slightly from emotion, he declared, "I never sought recognition or wealth. I only ever wanted my daughters to have a future, a promise that even the humblest sacrifices are never lost if they are made with true love. Today, as I see this new beginning, I am reminded that love is not mere words. It is the courageous actions we take even when we are mocked, even when our hearts are heavy with loss." The speech was met with standing ovations, tears of joy, and the shared belief that this day had rewritten the narrative of not only one small family but of an entire community. In that moment, Mr. Duncan's lifelong struggles and sacrifices were crowned with an unexpected, life-affirming reward. The reward forged by the love of a father, the perseverance of daughters, and the unyielding belief that even the smallest flame of hope can light the way to a transformative future. Subscribe if you believe that love is not measured in words but in actions, that true sacrifice is always rewarded, and that sometimes a humble carpenter's example can change an entire town's destiny.